I've got a question for you. What would motivate you to quit your job on the spot? Higher pay? A much better occupation? Working in an improved location? What about working for a much kinder and more just boss or employer? How about all of the above? In this Sunday's Gospel, Jesus' invitation to some fishermen to leave their business and follow after him is best understood in the context of this question. What would motivate you to quit your job on the spot? Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. While the crowd was pressing in on Jesus and listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. He saw two boats there alongside the lake. The fishermen had disembarked and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, Jesus asked him to put out a short distance from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. After he had finished speaking, Jesus said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and lower your nets for a catch." Simon said to him in reply, "Master, we've worked hard all night and have caught nothing. But at your command, I will lower the nets." When they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets were tearing. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come to help them. They came and filled both boats so that the boats were in danger of sinking. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at the knees of Jesus and said, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For astonishment at the catch of fish they had made seized him, and all those with him, and likewise James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners of Simon. Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." Then they brought their boats to the shore. They left everything and followed him. Fascinating last comment there. They left everything and followed Jesus. Luke notes that Peter, and we can assume from this his brother Andrew, had a business partnership with yet another pair of brothers, James and John, in Luke chapter 5, verse 10. Chapter 5, verse 2 says they owned at least two boats. In 1986, a boat was discovered. It's a fascinating find. 7.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet high, with a rounded stern and an excellent bow. It was found close to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and carbon tests dated the boat to the period of 140 BCE to 40 CE. Physical anthropologists estimate that average Galilean males of the Roman Byzantine period stood about 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed about an average of 140 pounds. You could easily put into such a boat 15 such men. It would weigh just about over a ton. In the story in verse 3, Jesus steps into Peter's boat. The source of this story, of course, is Mark, the first gospel. Mark explains that one boat held at least 5 passengers, James and John, their father Zebedee, and hired men. in Mark chapter 1, verse 20. So they left their father Zebedee, they being James and John, in the boat along with the hired men and followed him. There could have been many more. In the Greek and Roman period, fish had become a very popular commodity. It is not against reason to guess that this specific partnership, called by us the Jonah-Zebedee Fishing Syndicate, flourished. So what would prompt these four males, who were probably teenagers, to leave everything and follow Jesus in verse 11? Was it Jesus' invitation alone? For a man to call followers in the Mediterranean culture is readily recognized by every native there as a process of a patron gathering clients, creating a fictive family or fictive kinship network. It's a very real relationship, it's a very real family, but it's not biological, hence fictive. In cultures like the ancient Mediterranean world, where central government was thought to be weak and ineffective, people banded together for mutual assistance. For the most part, La Familia, the family, was very strong, very close-knit, stuck together, and helped each other out. People lived together in compounds of 50 to 100 persons each. Very strong, very loyal. But sometimes problems were too great. Sometimes it became necessary to reach beyond La Familia, beyond the 50 to 100 person kinship network living together, and form a fictive family, a family-like bond with others going through the same turmoil and strife and problems and crises, and join up with someone who could lend the help that your own biological family members couldn't. A coalition, a political faction. And this particular someone who can give what your own family members can't is called a patron. That is, a person who has surplus means and who distributes that surplus by purely personal whim and choice. Think about what is going on in the story. A Galilean peasant artisan day laborer comes into a town full of fishermen. He doesn't know anything about fishing, but somehow after a brutally frustrating night of work without a single fish caught, this Galilean peasant is able to provide seasoned and experienced fishermen with a bountiful catch of fish. Obviously, there is more than meets the eye with this Galilean peasant day laborer named Jesus. He is obviously presenting himself as a patron, or perhaps better, as the representative of a patron, someone called a broker. And given the nature of the wondrous catch of fish, which is obviously beyond the capacity of human skill and effort, in this case, the patron is the God of Israel, and Jesus must be his representative, because he can broker deals with the God of Israel as a holy man. The broker is someone who can get for you something you cannot obtain by your own abilities, or on better terms than you could arrange for yourself. He's the person who can do for you more than your own family members can do for you. He's the person who can go beyond what your family can do. Jesus the broker gets the better of these fisher people at their own game. In Luke's story, Simon, James, and John clearly perceive Jesus in this role as holy representative to the patron God of Israel. That's why Simon Peter falls to the knees. Simon Peter is using a specific Mediterranean gesture that recognizes Jesus as his social superior, as the one who is broker representative for him to the patron. Luke notes that Simon and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken in verse 9. When they reached the shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. Verse 11. Now, it's possible that everybody in the boats followed Jesus, but we know that Simon, Andrew, James, and John did. But apparently, Jonah and Zebedee, their fathers, did not. What was the everything that these teenagers, and they probably were teenagers, left? Well, it had to have been more than boats and nets and fish. The everything that they left included their social network, which meant other patrons, friends, and neighbors in their home village, in addition to the relatives, father, mother, wife, in-laws. If you looked at them and you were an ancient Mediterranean villager, Israelite villager, looking at them leave with Jesus, you would think these teenagers were crazy. Unless you saw what they saw in this new patron, this new broker, Jesus. Something that they could not get anywhere else from anyone else. It's not entirely clear what the followers of Jesus, his new clients, saw. but certainly it must have been more than fish. They were convinced by this wondrous catch of fish, at least in Luke's story, that Jesus was the holy man broker that they needed. The one who could barter for them, get for them what they really needed from the patron God of Israel. In mainstream United States culture, we 21st century Westerners take great pride in standing up on our own 2 feet and winning and achieving and accomplishing, and in not having to rely on anybody else. We adore the self-made woman or self-made man. We applaud those who pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. We mythologize our winners and doers in this society. In our comic books, our Mediterranean ancestors in the faith, people like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, if they could, from their time and culture, look through the centuries and see us, Western Christians, in the 21st century, they would think of us as insane, flirting with death and extinction. How very different we are from our ancestors in the faith of the New Testament times. My friends, to follow Jesus, the Mediterranean Israelite broker, holy man, as a client of the patron God of Israel in this first century world, or to follow Jesus, truly God and truly man, as a Christian disciple in the modern Western world, both involve a willingness to be utterly dependent. You have to give up apparent security for a perceived greater security. Are we Americans up to this kind of surrender? Galilean illiterate fishermen in the first century, Peter, Andrew, James, John, men we call saints, certainly were. Why did the historical Jesus gather around himself an inner circle of followers? Why did he call the 12 to begin with? Was he a teacher looking for students? Or was he the founder of a religion, looking for people he could trust to be leaders of churches? What was going on, and how can we know it for sure? Just as we've seen that we can reach certainties about Jesus' existence and cultural limitations, about how he understood religion, and what exactly his ministry was about, we can also be reasonably certain that the historical Jesus formed a political faction. In the ancient and contemporary Middle East, leaders gather followers and form political factions for the purpose of gaining some advantage over others. Those who follow a leader know and understand full well what the leader is after. They join the leader because they believe that in unity there is strength, that this group together can achieve more, and achieve it more effectively, than any individual might do alone. Each group member is strongly bonded with a leader. In contrast, the group members belonging to the political faction have, at least initially, weak bonds with each other. We glimpse examples of this in the political religious movement of the historical Jesus. This is in contrast to the later fictive kin Jesus groups of Paul, which were examples of domestic religion, with all members bound together as if they were related kin, with fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, and so forth. All sources agree that after Jesus' career was over, a group or coalition existed that previously had been closely connected to Jesus. If such a group did exist, then it must have been formed within the framework of Jesus' historical concern. And as we've seen, Jesus' historical concern was political religion, namely Israelite theocracy. Since Jesus' historical concern was with theocracy, then this group of inner followers was related to Israelite theocracy. They were a set of persons who witnessed to Jesus' politically religious program. Within a political institution, a group formed to support someone's program is called a faction. Hence, we can be certain that Jesus formed a political faction. Factions, by definition, are coalitions. That is, groups formed by a central person for a specific purpose,
and a specific time. But how can we know this for certain? By applying the prevailing scholarly criteria. The criterion of embarrassment demonstrates that the proclamation of Jesus, the kingdom of Skyvault is at hand, Israelite theocracy is here, it's coming now, proved vacuous. The kingdom of God, or Israelite theocracy, never manifested. So why would gospel writers invent an embarrassment of Jesus proclaiming a theocracy and gathering together a faction around him to help him with this task if the theocracy never came? Answer, they wouldn't. Therefore, the only reason that the gospel writers would write about this is that Jesus historically must have done this for sure, and thus we can know he gathered a coalition for this purpose for sure. The criterion of incongruity shows us tension in the gospel documents. The Gospels were composed by communities decades after Jesus and his first followers, and primarily interested in Jesus groups sticking together, like fictive families, like fictive kin groups belonging to a domestic religion. But in the Synoptic Gospels, when we read about these 12 recruits, Peter and the other followers of Jesus, they act like a faction of a political religion, rather than fictive kin group founders, as the later church spun them. Recall what I said earlier about how, unlike later domestic religious fictive kin Jesus groups, the Jesus movement originally was politically religious, with each faction member strongly bonded with Jesus the leader, but having weak bonds with one another. Should we be surprised that the brothers James and John, the sons of Zebedee, asked for the two highest places when Jesus comes into his glory? No. And neither should we be shocked by the angry reaction from the other 10, because these two beat them to the punch. Neither should we be surprised when, at the Last Supper, they all dispute among themselves about status and honor, and which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And we should also understand why, in the fourth gospel called John, the anonymous beloved disciple, "It's really Lazarus," stands out rather clearly as particularly favored by Jesus. He reclines next to Jesus at the table and obtains privileged information from him about the betrayer. Even Peter doesn't know this and has to use the beloved disciple as an intermediary to get to Jesus. All of these examples showcase something factual about the early days with Jesus. This inner circle of his followers were not really fictive kin members in a domestic religious Jesus group, and they certainly were not church founders, but rather, initially at least, were rival faction members, and they behaved as should be expected of such. The criterion of multiple attestation shows us that all the Synoptic Gospels, specifically elements taken from both Mark and Q, say that Jesus recruited a group of persons to assist him in proclaiming the forthcoming Israelite theocracy. And these independent sources mention this recruitment and an initial attempt at proclamation. Moreover, the pre-Gnostic version of Thomas mentions members of the 12 it calls disciples, but they behave like faction members, not church leaders. But never does Thomas mention anything about them being the 12, or 12 in number. The gospel called John mentions the 12 as disciples, and they behave accordingly. And finally, the criterion of coherence demonstrates consistency with Jesus' historical and cultural situation. All Synoptic Gospels report that group members accompanied Jesus on his final trip to Jerusalem, which is in conformity with a politically religious mission and typical of Mediterranean dyadic group personality types. And when he is arrested and shamefully put to death, in fear of being disgracefully associated with the apparently accursed Jesus, they flee. This definitely conforms to behavior in Jesus' Middle Eastern honor-shame culture. So, my friends, we can know for sure that the historical Jesus called other poor, starving Galileans to be part of his political movement, the Jesus movement. He formed them to be a political faction. Around him were an inner circle of followers. Later on, after they died, they were remembered at the roots of the first Jesus groups and gradually became legendary founder figures. Then, after centuries of pious anachronism, they were transformed into bishops, even monarchical bishops.